stage right now.
We're on. Lights, camera, action.
Hey everyone, Jordan and Drew back with you for another version of Rereading Together. This is the series we've been doing for Sunday school and to put out on our YouTube channel for a few weeks now. Our goal is to maybe make you laugh, maybe make you cry, at least make you wonder and think about the scriptures. We're trying to read the Bible together. And so in order to do that, Jordan and I have taken, over the last few weeks, an entire book of the Bible and read it start to finish, and then we've come together and had a conversation about it. You can go back and watch any of those from the last few weeks. We had a week with a guest appearance by our own Megan Alsine, which is a great discussion on the book of Ruth. Jordan and I have done the Gospel of Mark, we've done Philippians, we've done Titus, we've done Philemon, had some great conversations about Scripture. Today we're going to bring you something a little bit special. For Holy Week, we're going to take on a passion narrative. So what you're about to see is a live running commentary of Jordan and I watching Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ. Are you ready? Wouldn't that be funny?
That'd be terrible.
It would be so bad. We're not going to put you through that. A passion narrative in all four of our canonical Gospels is the point from which Jesus is betrayed by Judas and brought on trial all the way through his crucifixion. And sometimes we include the resurrection, but we're not going to include the resurrection in what we've read for today. So what we've read, Jordan and I, is Luke's passion narrative, the passion narrative from the Gospel of Luke. And it starts in Luke's Gospel in chapter 22, verse 66. And it goes all the way through the end of chapter 23. So that's what Jordan and I have read, and now we're going to have a little bit of a conversation about it. We do it through these fun categories, but we always start with kind of overall impressions. Jordan, what was your impression of reading this passion narrative from Luke? And maybe what was your impression of reading it during Holy Week?
I was surprised, because so often we know the story really well. It's like the one story we all know, really, like this and sort of Christmas.
Yeah.
And I was surprised by how many details there were in Luke's story that I hadn't picked up on before. So there's like 2 or 3 occasions where there's kind of like it almost feels like a throwaway detail comment that and before this, Herod and the priest were enemies, but they now became friends.
Yeah.
And you're kind of just like, why? Like, and I think because we know the story from 4 perspectives, but I think we miss out the unique detail that's in each story. And that was one thing that surprised me, was there was 2 or 3 occasions where there was like, like I honestly don't remember like registering this before.
Yeah, I had the same, I had a very similar impression when I read it. I was thinking about the fact, I was sort of conscious of the, peek behind the curtain.
Live action shot.
I was conscious of the fact that I was sort of combining gospel narratives in my mind as I was reading Luke's narrative. So I kind of had to stop myself and go, oh wait, Jesus doesn't do that in Luke's account. Jesus does it in another account, but Luke just leaves it out for one reason or another. Or Luke includes this detail, and I don't remember reading that from another account. So I was kind of conscious of doing that. But I did also find that I think it was profound to be reading a passion narrative in the middle of Holy Week and thinking about, like, this is what this week is building up to for us. We talked about it last Sunday in church. We've got the Good Friday service coming up this week. We're filming on Thursday afternoon. We got the Good Friday service coming up. We've got Easter morning coming up. And we might even think about what happens on Thursday night. Traditionally, that's Jesus washing the disciples' feet and serving the Last Supper. And then we might think about Saturday, the time actually in the tomb, when we really are kind of shrouded in darkness on this journey, right before the dawn of Easter morning. So just reading it in that sort of spirit of Holy Week was really good for me as well. It's good. Okay, our first category, Jordan, is Past is the Past. So tell us a little bit of background information that you thought was really helpful for reading and understanding the Passion narrative.
Yeah, I think it may seem obvious to say, but it's the context of Luke and Luke Acts together as traditionally one of the first Gospels that went to specifically a Gentile audience. So in particularly in the narrative of the Passion, it's much more about the innocence of Jesus versus the sort of the Jewishness of Jesus. And so there's very little made of the Jewish ramifications of what's going on here. But there's a lot made about how innocent Jesus is on kind of every stage of the journey. So I think that the important thing is sort of the context of Luke as this extended narrative, and where the main thread is Jesus' innocence, but also his willingness to go through with the incredible torment and pain and torture for his mission on earth, which is bringing God's kingdom near.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. And we see that even in, I mentioned a minute ago, the things that Luke leaves out. Luke doesn't include for us Jesus' Aramaic saying from the cross.
Right.
The my God, why have you forsaken me, which Jesus utters in Aramaic. And Mark and Matthew both write it in Aramaic for us as readers, which sort of is that kind of pointing back at Jesus' Jewishness. It's his mother tongue kind of a thing. Luke leaves it out. And he gives us other sayings of Jesus from the cross, but leaves that one out, and that's just an interesting, maybe a Gentile sort of perspective on the crucifixion. That's good.
And pretending Jesus as a king who's humble and who's gentle and who serves, and in contrast to the power of the religious leaders and the power of the Roman leaders.
Yeah.
Like Jesus' way of kingship is just much different.
Yeah. That's good. My bit of background information is a little bit more sort of detail-oriented. There's this thing in Luke's gospel, and it happens a little bit in the other Passion accounts, but Luke seems to highlight it more, this sort of passing back and forth between Pilate and Herod. So Jesus is arrested, and then he's before Herod, and then Herod sends him to Pilate, and Pilate sends him back to Herod, and he's sort of just bouncing back and forth. And like Jerusalem isn't that huge geographically, so there's probably not like a lot of movement going on here necessarily, but there's obviously a shifting of like whose authority is at play here. And that was a question in my mind as I was reading, and I was reminded that Herod has some sort of authority over Jewish people in this Roman-occupied territory, and Pilate has sort of ultimate authority as the Roman governor in this area. And so Jesus gets brought before Pilate first, and Pilate realizes he's a Jew, and then sends him to Herod. Well, that Jewishness, Luke does mention it there, and says that that's important for why Pilate sends him to Herod. Herod, you deal with him. If he's a Jew, you deal with him. I don't want, and this is sort of the washing my hands of things. Pilate just sends him to Herod. Herod then has this conversation with Jesus, or rather doesn't have a conversation with Jesus because Jesus doesn't say anything or doesn't say much. And then Herod wants to side with the crowd and send Jesus to his execution, but Herod doesn't have that power. So the Jews couldn't crucify anyone, which is why Jesus then has to come back to Pilate, because only the Romans can crucify someone. The Romans can carry out a death sentence. The Jews, it would have been treasonous, actually, under Roman law, to carry out a death sentence. So this is the reason Jesus is getting sort of ping-ponged back and forth between these two authorities, and why we get this sort of throwaway line about Herod and Pilate becoming friends after this episode, which no one else mentions. None of the other gospel writers mention. It's just an interesting thing that's going on in Luke's narrative.
And I'll say one more thing, Drew, that it's interesting how Luke describes what Passover is. Because no 3-year-old Jews know what Passover is.
Sure.
But the thing I think is more interesting is he describes it as the Feast of Unleavened Bread.
Yeah.
And especially when we think theologically about what we think the cross represents, we think about sin, we think about salvation, maybe even words like substitution. But that's not the point that Luke's making here at all. There's like none of that.
Yeah.
But when we think it's so easy to jump to, well, they had a lamb that was a sacrifice. Jesus is a lamb. He's our sacrifice to prevent us from death, like in Egypt, and it's the same for us now.
Yeah.
Because we're in the wilderness and we're separate. But like Luke just, so I think like we have to pause and say that we're so quick to jump to theological conclusions about the cross and what that represents, but just to experience it in this sort of narrative form, I think helps with that sort of journey.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I hadn't realized that, I'm like, if you're going to describe Passover, it's not about the bread.
Right.
That's like Christmas is about the Brussels sprouts. Like, it's not.
Yeah.
It like, so I just thought that was curious. And I don't have an answer for why he does that, but I just thought it was kind of very curious and shows the complete lack of sort of Jewishness or even pointed theological statements about what is happening here.
Yeah.
It's much more about the journey of going through to the cross with Jesus.
Yeah. And if we were, you posed the question, and I'm kind of thinking about what would our theological answer be to that, And I'm thinking Luke's audience is Gentile, but they are almost certainly Gentile Christians. So he's writing to people who believe in Jesus. So to draw attention in any way to the bread for Christians, even early Christians, would be to draw attention to Jesus' body, as in the body and blood at the Last Supper. So there is something sort of tangible and visceral and very like focused on Jesus' suffering, the bodily suffering that comes by way of drawing attention to the bread. I think that could be interesting.
Right. But when we so want to rush to the parallels with the lamb.
Yes. Yeah. No, I think that's good.
Yeah.
That's good. Okay, so tweet it. What's your best quote from this passion narrative, less than 280 characters?
Well, I think I want to give a little bit of a proviso to this. That I think that so often our Easter journey, we like fly to the resurrection, we fly to the tomb, that there, or the empty tomb rather, that there's very little theological weight given to experiencing like the cross and staying there. So it was with that in mind. So 22:53, and this is Jesus talking to the religious leaders, just before he gets arrested. Every day I was with you in the temple courts, and you did not lay a hand on me. But this is your hour when darkness reigns.
Oof. And
so I think that I think that's the most tweeted one, specifically about the cross and Good Friday, is that it's okay for us to rest in this place of pain and darkness.
Yeah.
And it doesn't need to be rushed to the cross, because that takes away, that the religious powers and the religious authorities and the Roman authorities, they were giving Jesus all they had.
Yeah.
And like so often it seems like the world is giving us all we can handle and is winning.
Yeah.
And I think that there was an hour where darkness reigned.
Yeah.
And we don't need to run away from that.
Yeah.
I think we can sit in that.
Yeah. No, I think that's good. And I mean, this comes just at the tail end of the narrative of Jesus' arrest. And so it really does set the stage for the whole, like it kind of governs the whole of this passion narrative, that this is a dark period in the story, rather than a period that's just like a stepping stone on the way to the light, kind of a thing. This is the central element of the narrative, and darkness is reigning. I think that's really interesting. And also, no one's going to watch this before Good Friday, but that's why we're going to darken the sanctuary for our Good Friday service. It's why we want to try to symbolize that darkness, to try to help us to contemplate it and feel it in that sense of being on the journey. It's good. My tweet is chapter 23, verse 34, which I chose because it is something that Jesus says from the cross, but is only found here in Luke's gospel. It's one of the sayings that is unique to Luke. And it's Jesus saying, after he has been raised up on the cross, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And Luke's the only one who records this saying for us. And it's one that we, again, are really familiar with and know well. But if we're thinking about like all of the things, all of the theological weight that hangs on the cross, as it were, this idea of Jesus forgiving even those who have put him physically on the cross. You know, we think about Jesus forgiving us even though we sin, even though we don't know what we're doing or whatever it is. We think about it in that sense, but also the very contextualized sense of Jesus saying, "Forgive them, the ones who have just raised me up on this cross," is a really powerful quote and image for me.
Yeah, certainly.
Okay, fish out of water. Is there anything that you feel like is sometimes taken out of context or misquoted or something like that in this passion narrative?
Well, I want to answer a little bit. I just thought this verse felt like a fish out of water in this narrative.
Okay.
So
good. I like it.
So this is 22:30, and this is Jesus as he's walking towards the Golgotha. He says, and women are weeping with him as he's on the journey, and he says, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children. For the time will come when you will say, Blessed are the childless women, the wombs that have never bore, and the breasts that were never nursed." I was like, where on earth does that come from? Like, that is pretty insane.
Yeah.
And I think obviously there's some prophetic underlying message there about the coming destruction and desecration of Jerusalem there.
Yeah.
But just that, and this is only recorded in Luke also.
Yeah.
And just one of those, you're thinking, that's weird.
Yeah.
And just what like a bizarre, like throwaway, esoteric, prophetic thing to say to these women who are mourning for him.
Yeah.
And he said, part of it, I think, is you're crying for me, but you don't know like what's going on in your life or what's going on in this city. Yeah. So it was one of those where it kind of threw me off, and it was a little strange to read.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's good. The one I chose was another one of Jesus' sayings that from the cross that we only have here in Luke, and it's chapter 23, verse 43, when Jesus says to one of the criminals hanging next to him, "Today you will be with me in paradise." And it comes after this conversation with the criminal, or between the two criminals. Yeah, one of them is ridiculing Jesus and mocking him. The other criminal then says to him, "Why are you doing this? We're getting what we deserve. This man's innocent." Again, Luke just nodding at Jesus' innocence all the way through this narrative. But then at the end of this, that the criminal who rebukes the other criminal says, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus says, "Truly, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." We only have this recorded in Luke. And I've at least heard this sometimes a little bit taken out of context as that sort of, even someone can even accept Jesus on their deathbed, right? It doesn't matter what kind of life they lived. They can even, and I think that's true. I think someone can come to a belief in Jesus and throw their entire life in Jesus' hands on their deathbed. I think that's possible. I definitely think it's not like a fail-safe for us. Like, I can just live my life how I'd like to live it, and then at some point, as I come to the end, I'll then give my life to Jesus, and Jesus will say to me, "Truly today you'll be with me in paradise." I don't think that's the point of Luke including this at all. I think it is something like Luke including for us the idea that Jesus and God can work outside of our structures of discipleship. Like, we should work as disciples to follow Jesus. But in Luke, the disciples misunderstand all the way along the way. And then this criminal just gets it in that moment before death. I think that's kind of the point of Luke including this, and not this sort of...
And even that partnered with Jesus asking for forgiveness for the centurion's gambling for his clothes.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I think that's good. Okay, so ancient connection. What do you think is a takeaway that maybe Luke's audience or the early church would have gotten from this passion narrative?
Well, I think this is on the nose. It's the scene with Barabbas and Jesus, unlike who the crowd wants to have. Yeah. And so Barabbas literally means son of God. His name, Bar, son of Abba, father, like son of God, is like his name. Yeah. And his name is Jesus. Yeah. Jesus Barabbas. So you have Jesus, son of God, and Jesus, son of God. Yes. One is guilty, one is innocent. One's called a rebel, one's actually a rebel. Yes. And so it's like this, it's almost comical. Yeah. How on the nose this little scene is. Yeah. And Herod, or whoever was it Pontius or Herod?
It's Pilate. Yeah, because Pilate has the authority to
Pilate was like the crowd, like, this man is innocent. Yeah. And so it's you have the judge, and then you have the innocent Jesus and the guilty Jesus. And the crowd asks for the guilty, murderous, rebellious Jesus to be freed. Yeah. And I thought that's such like a parallel of how much the people didn't get what they were asking for.
Yeah, and I think you're right that like Luke's audience or anyone reading this in the context of the first century just doesn't miss that. Right. And we have to sort of have it explained. It makes for a good sermon point. Like it's good to explain it, but I think you're right. The ancient audience would have just been like, ooh, yeah, I get the irony just immediately. It's good. Okay, my ancient connection is the passage you picked for fish out of water. This scene where Jesus is walking toward the cross, toward the hill where he'll be crucified, and there's some women following him who are mourning, and Jesus turns to them and says this crazy saying about daughters of Jerusalem, don't weep for me, weep for yourselves and your children, for the time will come when you will say, blessed are the childless women, the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed. Then they will say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. And here's the key verse, I think, for me in the ancient audience. For if people do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it's dry? And I think what he's sort of alluding to there, what I think Luke is alluding to there through these words of Jesus, is the idea that if Jesus, who came in peace, who is preaching a kingdom of peace, a kingdom where powers get overthrown, but where there is no more war, a kingdom where there is service, where the first are last and the last are first, all of these things, if crucifixion is what they do to the Prince of Peace, what will they do to the actual warlords?
Right.
Who will rise up in Israel in the coming days, and as you alluded to, looking toward the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in the year 70, that's a proper insurrection, a proper insurrection. And the military uprising that happens in that moment, I think Luke's alluding to that and saying, and using it as a contrast to how Jesus comes as one who is serving, who is as one who is humble, as one who is eventually humiliated on the cross. And if the mourners are mourning for that, how much more will they mourn when the actual military warlords come in and squash a rebellion? And I think that connection would have been made for the ancient audience, where we kind of miss it a little bit.
That's good. Okay,
so how about a contemporary connection? What do you think is a takeaway for us as a 21st century church?
Yeah, I have chapter 22, verse 26 and 27. The kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who exercise authority over them call themselves benefactors. But you are not to be like that. Instead, the greatest among you should be like the youngest, and the one who rules like the one who serves. And I think for me, it's a critique of who are the people we prioritize, whose favor do we want, and like what audience are we catering to. And I think a lot of my experience at least, we want to look after people who are wealthy. We want to look after the privileged, and we want them to come and support our church so we can keep like our salaries paid and keep the doors open. But having that posture of not wanting anything out of a relationship, but just coming to serve.
Yeah,
I think that's a strong critique.
Yeah, that's good. As I was thinking about a contemporary connection, I was thinking about the idea that Jesus dies at the hands of the state. And thinking about that in terms of not to like diminish Jesus's willingness to go to the cross, or to diminish his sacrifice, to diminish the idea that he's winning victory over sin in the cross. I think all of that is there theologically and in the New Testament. I don't want to diminish that at all. But I also don't think that we can ignore the fact that he dies at the hands of the state on a Roman cross in an execution style that was reserved for revolutionaries, and the connections that we can make to others who have died at the hands of the state throughout history and even in the 21st century. And thinking about it in terms of, we talk about Jesus being a mediator as one who has experienced the fullness of humanity. That, I think, is a part of humanity that I won't ever have to experience, death at the hands of the state. But there are some who have, and so has Jesus. So in terms of like who can Jesus be in solidarity with, it's everyone. And it includes even those that we think are unworthy of Jesus' solidarity, those who we would, as Americans at least, condemn to death at the hands of the state. And I think that's an interesting connection for us to make alongside the other theological connections we make with Jesus' death on the cross.
That's powerful.
Okay, so let's phone a friend. Who's your phone a friend? Who are you calling about the Gospel of Luke today?
We're going to downtown Nashville.
Okay.
You have Vanderbilt University professor Amy Jill Levine.
Yeah.
So she's a well-renowned history of Old Testament, and particularly like the Jewish life or the Jewish cultural influences on New Testament time. Yeah. She has a particularly well-renowned book called The Scandal of the Jewish Jesus. And she's written a commentary on Luke that's just Luke, a commentary by Amy Jo Levine. So I'd encourage you guys to check her out.
Yeah, that's good. I'm going to call my friend Peter. Maybe you've heard of him. He's an apostle.
Oh.
That was a joke. Jordan's not laughing at my jokes today.
I never do.
You never do. That's a good point. I'm actually not phoning Peter, but I am phoning the Gospel of Peter, which is not written by Peter. No scholars think it's written by the Apostle Peter. All right, so we'll put that out of our minds. But it goes under Peter's name. All right, it's an apocryphal gospel. It was probably written 50 or 100 years after the canonical gospels. But what we actually have left in manuscript form of the Gospel of Peter is just a passion narrative, which is interesting.
For clarity for the listeners, not the letters to Peter, a separate gospel that's not in our Bibles.
Not 1 Peter, not 2 Peter, also not the Gospel of Mark, which is by church tradition attached to Peter, and Mark is one of Peter's disciples. This is an apocryphal gospel, not in our canon. Not with the same authority as the Gospel of Luke. Let's be clear about all of that. Thank you. But this is called the Gospel of Peter, and what we have left of the Gospel of Peter is a passion narrative. And one of the interesting things that the Gospel of Peter's passion narrative brings out is the fact that the Jews who were around and who are shouting "Crucify" in the Gospel of Peter, they're very concerned to get Jesus on the cross and dead before the sun goes down. Well, why? It has to do with the Sabbath. And we get an indication in Luke's gospel that there is just this hint of Sabbath observance that the Jews are still trying to maintain in the midst of shouting "Crucify" and getting Jesus up on a cross. So at the very end of chapter 23, the last verse that we read for today's passion narrative, it says that the women who had seen where the burial had happened, they went home and prepared spices and perfumes, but they rested on the Sabbath in obedience of the commandment. In the Gospel of Peter, the Jews are losing their minds in the Gospel of Peter when darkness happens at the 6th hour, when the darkness starts to reign while Jesus is on the cross. They're worried he hasn't died yet and the sun's already gone down, because you can't put someone to death on the Sabbath. By the way, we maintain this law in America in 2021. You cannot be put to death at the hands of the state, capital punishment, from sundown Friday until sundown on Sunday. So both Sabbath days, the Sabbath observance day in Jewish tradition and the Sabbath observance day in Christian tradition, we don't put people to death on Friday sundown to Sunday sundown, which is bonkers. Sunday at midnight,
Mondays and Tuesdays.
Sunday at midnight, 12:01 on Monday morning, you can be put to death by capital punishment. But Friday evening to Sunday midnight, you can't be put to death in 2021. Bonkers. But anyway, that's beside the point at the moment. The Jews in the Gospel of Peter are worried that Jesus hasn't died and it's already sundown, which means they will be putting someone to death on a Sabbath day. Okay, this Sabbath observance thing shows up in the canonical Gospels as well, the Gospels in our Bible. Every once in a while we just get hints of it. And it, for me, just is that weird play on we're trying to continue our religious observance while exercising this hypocrisy of injustice, and that just gets blown up in the Gospel of Peter, and it's in little pieces of the Gospel of Luke and in our canonical Gospels. But I think that's just a really interesting thing in this whole narrative, that they're trying to maintain this religious purity while doing something that the whole narrative tells us is unjust. And I think that's really interesting. All right, last one, MVP. What's the most valuable passage of this passion narrative?
This one you alluded to earlier. It's the criminal's comments from the cross. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And I think that's important because that's like the criminal in the little time he had next to Jesus noticed that something was different about him, noticed that there was something special about him. And throughout our interaction with Jesus in Luke and Acts, that's what we're called to do, is recognize that there's something different.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. My MVP isn't an actual verse. It's a little bit of a curveball. I'm going to go with Jesus' silence as the MVP.
Oh, clever.
Which I think is interesting. And Luke brings out really clearly that every time Jesus is before Herod or before Pilate, he either gives no response to the questions that he's being peppered with, or he says, it is as you say it is. You're the one who says I'm the king of the Jews. He gives this very simple response and just turns it back on them. And then he's sort of silent all the way through that entire trial. And Tom Wright makes the point that Luke's narrative in particular demonstrates for us that sometimes the best way to speak truth is through silence. and that Jesus is allowing everyone else to make the point of who he is. He's the King of the Jews. He's innocent. Pilate keeps calling him innocent, even though Jesus isn't answering any questions. He's not denying anything. He's not affirming anything. So everyone else is sort of demonstrating who Jesus is, and Jesus is just standing in silence. And I think that's a powerful thing, especially through the trial, the arrest and trial portion of the narrative in Luke.
Good.
Cool. Thanks, Jordan.
Thank you, Drew.
Appreciate the conversation. We'd love to hear your feedback. If you have thoughts on the Passion narrative in Luke or anything kind of around these events of Holy Week, we'd love to hear from you on that. We'll see you again next week, but thanks for joining us.